The boy had been sitting on that bench for almost 4 hours, and still the first thing he did when he saw the old man stop on the path and lean hard on his cane was stand up and say, "Sit here, sir. Please, I was just leaving." No one around them noticed. No one paused. In a city like Pittsburgh, in a park like Allegheny Commons on a raw afternoon in early December, a thin black boy speaking to a stooped white-haired stranger was the kind of small moment that the world had taught itself to walk past. The way you walk past a bird with a broken wing because looking at it too long will ask something of you that you do not believe you can give. But that boy, Samuel Greer, 11 years old and so light on his feet that the older boys at the shelter sometimes called him Sparrow, did not know that the man steadying himself on the brass-handled cane was worth more money than every building, every bridge, every barge on the river he could see from where he stood. He only knew that the man's hands were shaking. He only knew that the man's breath was coming in small, broken clouds, the way breath comes when a body has decided it is done. He only knew that giving up a bench, even when the bench was the warmest place he had found all day, was the kind of thing his grandmother had told him to do before she went into the home, back when she could still say his name without forgetting it. That single decision, made on a cracked park bench under a sky the color of wet slate, would set in motion a story that the city of Pittsburgh, and eventually a great many other places, would carry quietly for the rest of their lives. Before we go any further, leave a comment telling me where in the world you are watching from, and if stories of small kindnesses moving across great distances mean something to you, hit the subscribe button so the next one finds its way to you. Pittsburgh in early December had a way of looking older than it was. The kind of old that came from coal smoke long since gone but still remembered, from steel mills that had closed before half the people walking past their husks had been born, from rivers that had carried so much and now mostly carried the reflection of a sky that could not seem to decide whether to rain or simply hang there, gray and heavy, as a kind of weather all its own. The wind came down the Allegheny in long, patient gusts, finding the gaps between buttons, the spaces under collars, the open places between a thin glove and a bony wrist. It rattled the iron fence around the old bandstand. It pushed dry leaves in slow circles around the feet of a bronze statue no one stopped to read anymore. It found Samuel Greer where he was sitting on a green wooden bench under a sycamore tree and reminded him, the way it had been reminding him for 2 weeks now, that he could not sit still for very long without the cold becoming a problem he did not know how to solve. He was wearing a navy blue parka with a broken zipper that he kept closed with a safety pin near the collar and another one near the waist. His jeans were 2 inches too short, and the gap between the cuff and the top of his sneakers showed a strip of skin that had gone the color of paper left out in the sun. The sneakers themselves had once been white. They were not white anymore. In his lap sat a brown paper bag with the top folded down neatly, the way his grandmother had taught him to fold the tops of bags so the contents inside would feel cared for. Inside the bag was a half-eaten granola bar a woman near the bus station had pressed into his hand that morning, a library card he could no longer use because the address on file was no longer his, and a small square photograph of his mother and grandmother standing in front of a Christmas tree the year before everything started to come apart. Samuel was waiting. He was not sure for what. He had been waiting for 2 weeks in different ways and in different places, ever since the apartment on Cedar Avenue had been padlocked by people in vests, and his grandmother had been moved to the memory care wing of a state facility he was not allowed to visit on his own. The case worker assigned to him had a name he had memorized, and a phone number he had memorized, and an office on the 4th floor of a building downtown where the elevator did not always work. And she had told him 3 different times now that a placement was coming, that a foster home was being arranged, that a bed was almost ready. Each time he had nodded, the way his grandmother had taught him to nod when adults said important things, and each time he had walked out of her office and back into a city that did not seem to know he existed. He had stopped going to the shelter after a boy twice his size had taken his shoes off his feet in the middle of the night and dared him to say a word about it. He had taken to walking instead, in long, careful loops through neighborhoods where the police did not stop a child with a backpack, and he had taken to sitting on benches in parks where the sycamores still had enough leaves to break the wind, and he had taken to keeping his hope folded small and tight inside his chest the way you fold a letter you cannot afford to lose. The old man who came walking down the path that afternoon did not look like a man who would ever need to ask anyone for anything. He was tall, even with the stoop that age had pressed slowly into his shoulders, and he walked with the kind of careful deliberateness of a man who had learned, somewhere in the last decade, that the ground was no longer something he could trust without paying attention to it. His hair was the white of clean cotton, parted neatly on the side in a style that had not changed since the year he had first parted it that way as a young man in 1962. He wore a long, camel-colored overcoat that fell almost to his ankles, well-tailored and well-cared for, but old enough that the cuffs had been turned once and sewn back into shape by someone who knew what they were doing. A dark green wool scarf was wrapped twice around his neck. His gloves were brown leather, supple from years of use, and the cane in his right hand was made of dark walnut with a brass handle worn smooth by a palm that had been gripping it for a long time. His name was Edward Holloway, and he was 81 years old, and he had walked too far that day for a man whose cardiologist had told him 3 times that walking too far was no longer something he was permitted to do. He had not come to Allegheny Commons by accident. He had been driven, as he was always driven now, but he had asked his driver to let him out 3 blocks from the park entrance because there were things Edward Holloway needed to look at on foot, things he could no longer see from the back seat of a car. He had wanted to see the old fountain where his wife had once made him pose for a photograph in 1971, when they were both young and new to the city, and convinced that everything good in their lives was still ahead of them. He had wanted to see the path she used to make him walk every Sunday afternoon, the long curving one that passed under the sycamores and ended at the bandstand. He had wanted to see these things because his wife had been gone for 9 months now, and he had finally reached the point, in the slow, terrible work of grief, where he had stopped being afraid of the places that would hurt him to visit. He had not counted on the wind. He had not counted on the way his left knee, which had been replaced twice already, would begin to lock up after the first half-mile. He had not counted on the cold finding its way into his chest the way it had, settling there, pressing down, making the breath he took in feel smaller than the breath he let out. He had stopped on the path near the bench under the sycamore because his body had stopped him, the way a body sometimes stops a stubborn old man when his pride will not. He had leaned hard on the cane, more weight on it than he had ever put on it before, and he had felt with a clarity that frightened him, the way the brass handle bit into his palm and the way the walnut shaft trembled just slightly between the ground and his hand. And then, before he could even look up to see where he was, a small voice from somewhere near his elbow said, "Sit here, sir, please, I was just leaving." Edward turned his head. His eyes, which had once been a sharp pale blue and were now the softer blue of a sky in winter, took a moment to focus on the small face looking up at him. He saw the parka with the safety pins. He saw the 2 short jeans. He saw the paper bag clutched against the boy's chest with both arms, the way a child clutches the only thing he owns. He saw the eyes. The eyes were what stopped him. They were dark and serious and held in them the strange, premature carefulness of a child who had learned, far too early, that asking for help was a luxury he could not afford and offering it was a courtesy he could not abandon. "Were you?" Edward said. His voice was rougher than he had intended it to be, the cold having worked its way into his throat. "Were you really just leaving?" Samuel did not answer right away. He had been taught by his grandmother and before her by his mother that lying to old people was a particular kind of sin because old people had earned the truth, and lying to them was a small theft from someone who had already given enough. But he had also been taught that some truths were better spoken sideways, the way you might step around a puddle instead of through it, and so he said, "I was going to leave soon, sir. The bench was getting cold anyway." Edward looked at the boy for a long moment. He had spent 53 years in business and another 15 on the boards of half the major philanthropic institutions in the state of Pennsylvania. And in all that time, he had developed a particular skill for hearing what a person was actually saying underneath the words they had chosen to use. He heard it now. He heard the careful, gentle dishonesty of a child who had nowhere else to go and was offering a stranger the warmest seat in the park anyway. He felt something shift in his chest that had nothing to do with the cold or his heart or the long walk that had nearly emptied him. "Then I would be very grateful," Edward said slowly, "if you would let me sit for just a few minutes." He lowered himself onto the bench with the slow caution of a man whose body had become a kind of fragile cargo he was responsible for transporting through the world. The wood was cold through his coat, but the relief of being off his feet was so immediate and so complete that he closed his eyes for a second. Samuel did not leave. He had said he was leaving, and he had meant to leave, but when he saw the old man close his eyes on the bench, he found that his feet had not moved. He stood there on the path with the paper bag still pressed against his chest, watching the small, irregular rise and fall of the camel-colored coat, and he understood with the quick, clear understanding that children sometimes possess and adults sometimes lose, that walking away from this man right now would be a thing he could not take back. So he stayed. He took one step back from the bench so as not to crowd the old man, and he waited, the way he had waited for many things in the last few weeks, with his hands quiet and his face still. Edward opened his eyes after about a minute. The shaking in his hands had begun to ease. The wind, which had been hitting him head-on as he walked the path, was broken now by the wide trunk of the sycamore behind the bench, and the cold that had been settling into his chest had stopped pressing quite so insistently. He looked up and saw the boy still standing there, and the corner of his mouth lifted in something that was not yet a smile but was a kind of soft acknowledgement, the way a window cracks open on a still day. "You did not leave," Edward said. "No, sir." "Why not?" Samuel considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. He shifted the paper bag in his arms. He looked at the old man's hands, at the way the right one was still curled around the brass handle of the cane, as if he were not yet ready to trust that he could let it go. "I thought maybe you should not be by yourself just yet," Samuel said. "Just in case." Edward did not say anything for a moment. He was a man who had been spoken to with great care by a great many people over the course of his life, by employees who wanted promotions and lawyers who wanted retainers and charities who wanted endowments. And he had learned over the years to recognize the difference between the careful words of a person who wanted something from him and the careful words of a person who simply did not want him to feel small. The boy's words were the second kind. They were the kind he had not been spoken to in almost a year, not since his wife had died, and the world had become very quiet around him in the way the world becomes quiet around the recently widowed, as if the people you knew were afraid that any sudden noise would shatter you. "That is kind of you," Edward said. "What is your name?" "Samuel, sir, Samuel Greer." "Samuel." Edward let the name rest on the cold air between them. "Do you live near here, Samuel?" Samuel did not answer right away. He had been asked this question in different ways by different adults over the last 2 weeks, and he had learned that the answer to it was a kind of door that, once opened, was very hard to close. He looked down at his sneakers. He looked at the small strip of skin between the cuff of his jeans and the top of his shoes. He looked back up at the old man, who was watching him with an expression that did not seem to be hurrying him toward any particular answer. "Sort of, sir," Samuel said. Edward nodded slowly. He had heard sort of in many forms over the course of his life. He had heard it from clients who could not quite say they were about to declare bankruptcy. He had heard it from foundation applicants who could not quite say they had been turned down by every other source. He had heard it from a young man at his own factory once, almost 40 years ago, who had not quite been able to say that his wife had left him and taken the children and that he was sleeping in his car in the parking lot. Edward had learned that sort of was a word that asked you to ask the next question gently or not at all. "And is someone expecting you somewhere this afternoon?" he asked gently. Samuel shook his head. "Not particularly, sir." "Not particularly," Edward repeated. He turned the phrase over slowly, the way he might have turned a small, smooth stone in his palm. "I see." He did not press further. He looked instead out across the park at the bare trees, at the dry brown grass, at the path curving away toward the bandstand where his wife had once stood in a yellow coat, and laughed at something he had said and made him feel, for the duration of that laugh, like the most fortunate man in the city. He let the silence sit. He had learned, over a long life of difficult conversations, that silence was not an absence of communication but a form of it, and that the most important things a person was willing to tell you would often arrive in their own time if you simply made room for them. After a moment, Samuel said, very quietly, "Are you all right, sir? You were breathing kind of funny when you stopped." Edward turned his head and looked at the boy. He saw the question for what it was. It was not the question of a stranger making polite conversation. It was the question of a child who had been watching him carefully and had decided, after some private calculation Edward could not see, that the question needed to be asked out loud. "I walked a little farther than I should have today," Edward said honestly. "My doctor would not be pleased with me." "My grandmother had a doctor like that," Samuel said. "She used to call him her shepherd. She said he kept trying to hurt her toward things she did not want to do." Edward laughed. It was a short, surprised sound, and it caught even him off guard. He had not laughed, not really laughed, in a very long time. The sound came out of him with the rusty quality of a hinge that had not been used in months, and once it was out, he was surprised by how unfamiliar it felt in his own chest. He looked at the boy, who was looking back at him with a small, careful expression, as if he had not been sure whether the joke was the kind that was allowed to be a joke. "Your grandmother sounds like a wise woman," Edward said. "She is, sir." Samuel said it quietly, and then after a small pause that Edward did not miss, he added, "She used to be a school nurse for 31 years. Edward heard the change in the verb. He had a son who was a lawyer in Philadelphia and a daughter who was a surgeon in Boston, and he had spent enough of his life listening to the precise way each of them used words to know that a child who corrected his own grammar in the middle of a sentence was a child who was managing a wound. He did not point it out. He did not push. He simply let the small adjustment sit there between them on the cold air, and he understood it, and he allowed Samuel to understand that he understood it without saying a word. 31 years, Edward said. That is a great deal of skinned knees. Samuel almost smiled. The corner of his mouth lifted just a little and then dropped again. She used to say she had seen every kind of crying there was. The kind that needed a bandage, and the kind that needed a story, and the kind that needed both. Which one did she give you when you needed it? Samuel looked down at the paper bag in his arms. He held it a little tighter. The wind moved through the bare branches above them and made a sound like dry paper being turned in another room. Both, sir. Usually both. Edward nodded slowly. He looked at the boy for a long, quiet moment, and he made a decision in the back of his mind. The kind of decision that he had been making in boardrooms and on factory floors and at his own kitchen table for 60 years. But which he had not had occasion to make about another human being in a very long time. He decided that this boy was not going to be left on this bench when he stood up. He decided it the way he had decided, many decades ago, that the small machine shop he had bought from a man who could no longer pay his employees was worth saving even though every consultant he had hired had told him it was not. He decided it quietly without telling anyone, including himself in any words that would have been audible to himself, and once the decision was made, he simply began to arrange around it. "Samuel," he said, "may I ask you something that you do not have to answer?" "Yes, sir." "When did you last eat a hot meal?" Samuel did not answer for a moment. He thought about the question the way a child thinks about whether a step on a staircase will hold his weight. The hot meal he was being asked about was so far behind him that he had to count backward in days to find it, and the counting embarrassed him. "A few days, sir," he said finally. "Maybe 4. Edward absorbed the answer the way a deep field absorbs a long rain. He did not flinch. He did not make a face. He did not do any of the small involuntary things that adults sometimes did when a child told them a true thing about hunger, because Edward had learned over the course of a long life that those small involuntary things were a kind of theft from the child who had been brave enough to say the true thing in the first place. He simply nodded once slowly, as if Samuel had told him the time. "I see," Edward said. "Thank you for telling me." He shifted his weight forward on the bench and reached, with some effort, into the inside pocket of his coat. Samuel saw the movement, and his shoulders tightened. He had been on the receiving end of enough offered money over the last 2 weeks to know how it felt, and how much he hated it. The folded bill, pressed into the hand of a child standing alone in a park, was a kind of kindness that was easier on the giver than the receiver. It closed the door of the moment instead of opening it. Edward saw the tightening of Samuel's shoulders, and he understood it, and he did not produce a wallet. What he produced instead was a small leather case. He opened it carefully. Inside were several plain white business cards. He took one out, and he closed the case, and he slipped it back into his pocket. Then he held the card out between 2 gloved fingers and said, "This has my name on it and a telephone number. If you would do me the favor of holding on to it, I would be grateful." Samuel took the card. His fingers were so cold that the heavy paper felt warm by comparison. He looked down at it. Printed in plain black letters, no logo, no embellishment, was a name, Edward T. Holloway. Below it, a phone number, nothing else. He did not know, holding that card on a December afternoon in Allegheny Commons, that the name Edward T. Holloway had been written on hospital wings and university buildings and library wings across the state of Pennsylvania for nearly 40 years. He did not know that the small machine shop Edward had bought in 1968 had grown over 53 years into a quietly held industrial holdings group that owned interests in steel, in shipping, in water purification, in 3 different aerospace suppliers, in a chain of regional hospitals, and in a great many other things he kept deliberately out of the newspapers. He did not know any of that. He only knew that the old man had given him a card with a name and a number, and that he had given it without the usual conditions attached, without the look that said, "Now you owe me something," without the small possessive smile of a person who had just made himself feel better at a child's expense. Samuel slipped the card very carefully into the inside pocket of his parka, the same pocket where he kept the small photograph of his mother and grandmother. It went in next to them, against the safety pin he had used to close a small tear in the lining a week ago against his heart. "Thank you, sir," he said. Edward nodded. He sat for another minute on the bench, allowing his breath to settle, allowing the trembling in his legs to ease. Then, with the slow, careful motion of a man who knew he would need to do it eventually and was choosing his moment, he placed both hands on the brass handle of his cane and began to stand. Samuel saw the effort of it, and without thinking, stepped forward and placed one small hand under Edward's elbow. He did not pull. He did not push. He simply offered the slight steady pressure of his own weight as a point of reference for the old man's body to find its balance against. Edward came to his feet. He stood for a moment, leaning on the cane and on the small hand under his elbow, and he allowed himself the brief private dignity of letting another person help him. He had not allowed many people to help him in the 9 months since his wife had died, because the help had always come wrapped in pity, and he had not had the strength to sort through the pity to find the actual help underneath. The boy's hand under his elbow was not wrapped in anything. It was just a hand. "Thank you, Samuel," Edward said. "Yes, sir." Edward looked down at the boy. He was a full head and a half taller than Samuel, even with the stoop, and the difference between them looked almost comical. The tall man in the long camel coat and the small boy in the parka with the safety pins. But there was nothing comical about the moment itself. The wind had quieted for a few seconds, the way wind sometimes does in a park, and a single dry leaf came down from somewhere above them and landed silently on the bench they had just left. "I'm going to ask you something," Edward said. He spoke slowly, the way he had spoken to his own children when they were small, and he had wanted them to understand that what he was about to say was a real question and not a command dressed up as one. "And I would like you to feel free to say no. About a half-mile from here on the other side of the park, there is a small place I sometimes go to in the afternoon. It is run by a woman named Margaret. The soup is honest, and the bread is warm, and they will not ask either of us any questions we do not feel like answering. I'm going to walk there now, slowly, because slowly is the only way my doctor will allow me to walk. I would be glad of your company if you would join me. And if you do not feel like joining me, Samuel, you may keep the card and use the number whenever you like, and we will say good afternoon here, and I will not be hurt." Samuel stood very still. The wind picked up again, and a small gust pushed at the back of his neck and ran down inside his parka where the safety pin near the collar had not quite done its full work. The cold went all the way down to the small of his back. He thought about the granola bar in the paper bag, the half he had been saving for the long, dark hours after the streetlights came on, when the cold pressed hardest. He thought about the bench, which would now be even colder because the warmth of the old man's body had been on it. He thought about the case worker who had not called, and the foster placement that had not come, and the older boy at the shelter with the eyes that knew exactly what they were taking. He thought about his grandmother, who had told him once, in a hospital bed where she was waiting for a procedure she had been frightened of, that the only thing a person ever truly carried out of this world was the small, quiet record of every time they had been kind to someone who could do nothing for them in return. He had been 8 years old when she had told him that, and he had not understood it the way she had meant it. He thought he might be beginning to understand it now. "Yes, sir," he said. "I would like to come with you." Edward did not show his relief on his face because he had learned long ago that adults who showed relief at a child's small, brave decisions sometimes made the child wonder if they had said the wrong thing. He simply nodded once as if a small, important arrangement had been concluded and gestured with his cane down the path. They walked. They walked very slowly. Edward set a pace that even Samuel, with his too short jeans and his too large sneakers, found himself adjusting downward to match. The cane tapped a steady, careful rhythm on the cold path. The bare branches of the sycamores moved above them in the wind. They passed an empty playground where the chains of the swings made a small, ghostly music in the moving air. They passed the bandstand where Edward had once watched his wife laugh in a yellow coat in 1971, and Edward slowed for a moment and looked at it, and then walked on without saying what he had been looking at. Samuel walked just slightly behind Edward and to his left, where the cane was not, so that if the old man stumbled, he would have somewhere to lean. He did not know that he had positioned himself this way, the way he did not know that he had been doing it for the same reason for his grandmother in the months before she had been taken to the home. The body remembers what the mind does not quite think about. "How old are you, Samuel?" Edward asked after a while. 11, sir." 11. Edward considered the number as if it were a small object in his hand. "I had a son when I was 26 years old. He is 53 now." It does not seem possible. Samuel did not know what to say to that, so he said nothing. He had learned that when adults said things that seemed to be addressed to themselves more than to him, the right thing to do was usually to leave a small open space where the next thought could land. "Do you go to school?" Edward asked. "I used to, sir. I'm supposed to be starting at a new one. The caseworker is figuring it out." "The caseworker?" "Yes, sir. Her name is Mrs. Alvarez. She has an office downtown." Edward did not respond immediately. The cane tapped twice on the path. A woman pushing a stroller came around the bend toward them, and Edward stepped slightly to the right to give her room, and Samuel mirrored him without thinking. The woman nodded at Edward and smiled at Samuel and did not appear to notice anything strange about the two of them walking together. "And until Mrs. Alvarez figures it out," Edward said carefully. "Where are you spending your nights, Samuel?" Samuel did not answer. The wind moved in the trees again. A pigeon flew up from the path in front of them in a soft, startled burst and resettled on the iron railing of the bandstand. "You do not have to answer that," Edward said quietly. "I am sorry I asked." "I have been moving around, sir." Samuel said it without looking up. "I am not sleeping in any one place very long. It is easier that way." "Easier," Edward repeated. "Safer, I guess." Edward did not press. He walked on. The path curved gently to the right and brought them out of the park and onto a quiet street of old brick row houses with narrow front steps and small wrought iron railings. The houses had been built in the 19th century and had been homes to working men with calloused hands, and then to families who had inherited them, and then to artists who could not afford the more fashionable parts of the city, and now to a mix of all of those things and more. About halfway down the block, on the corner of a smaller side street, was a single wide window with steam fogging the inside of the glass. The window belonged to a small place with a plain wooden sign above the door that read simply, in white painted letters, "Margaret's." Edward stopped at the door and looked at Samuel. "Before we go in," he said, "I want to tell you one thing. Margaret has known me for 38 years. She will be glad to see me, and she will be glad to see you, and she will not ask either of us any questions. If at any point you would like to leave, you only have to say so, and we will leave. There is no obligation to anything inside this door. Do you understand me, Samuel?" "Yes, sir." Edward opened the door. The bell above it gave a small, bright sound, and a wave of warm air came rolling out onto the cold sidewalk, and the smell of the inside of the place hit Samuel in the chest the way the smell of a place sometimes hits a person who has been outside too long. It smelled of bread. It smelled of butter and onions and something simmering slowly in a heavy pot. It smelled of clean dish towels and brewed coffee and a wood floor that had been mopped that morning. It smelled like the inside of the apartment on Cedar Avenue had smelled the year his grandmother had still been well enough to cook on Sundays. Samuel stood in the doorway with the warm air on his face and felt his shoulders come down from where they had been living up near his ears for 2 weeks. The room inside was small and low and unhurried. There were perhaps 10 tables, each covered with a plain blue and white checked cloth. The walls were a soft cream color, and there were framed black and white photographs hung along the back wall showing a younger woman in a kitchen, and a man with a beard holding up a loaf of bread and 2 small children at a beach. A short, sturdy woman in her mid-60s came out from behind a low wooden counter wiping her hands on a clean white towel. She had gray hair cut short and practical, and a pair of reading glasses pushed up on the top of her head, and when she saw Edward, she stopped in the middle of the floor and put one hand flat against her chest. "Edward Holloway," she said, "where on earth have you been?" "I am sorry, Margaret. The doctors have me on a short tether these days." "The doctors can mind their business." She crossed the room. She did not embrace him, because she had known Edward Holloway long enough to know that he did not like to be embraced. But she took both of his cold, gloved hands in her warm ones and squeezed them once, firmly. Then she looked down at Samuel, who was standing half a step behind Edward with the paper bag still clutched in front of him, and her face did not change in any sudden way. "And who is this gentleman?" she asked. "This is my friend Samuel Greer," Edward said. "He was kind enough to share his bench with me." Margaret looked at Samuel for a moment with the calm, frank attention of a woman who had spent 4 decades feeding people and had learned to read a great deal about a person from the way they stood in her doorway. She did not let her face do any of the things it might have done. She simply lowered herself with practiced ease until her face was almost level with his, and she said, "Samuel Greer, I'm very glad to meet you. I am Margaret. This is my place." "You are most welcome here." "Thank you, ma'am." "Are you a soup man or a sandwich man, Samuel?" He considered the question with the same care he had given every other one that afternoon. "I think both, ma'am, if that is all right." "That is the correct answer," Margaret said. She straightened. She looked at Edward and lifted one eyebrow about 1/4 of an inch, and Edward gave her in return the smallest possible nod, the kind that passed between people who had known each other for 38 years and did not need to say what they were saying. Margaret turned and led them to a table by the window where the late afternoon light was coming in soft and warm through the steamed glass. She pulled out the chair for Samuel as if he were a man of importance she had been expecting, and Samuel sat down with the same slow caution he had used in the bench. The chair was wooden and solid and well-worn, and the table was just the right height. Edward sat across from him and set his cane carefully against the wall. A young man in a long apron came by and set down a basket of bread, still warm, with a small dish of soft butter beside it. He set a tall glass of water in front of each of them and a small glass of milk in front of Samuel without being asked. Margaret had told him in a single look from the counter what was needed. "Eat as much of that bread as you like," Edward said. "Margaret will keep it coming. She is offended by an empty basket." Samuel reached for a piece of the bread. His hand was steadier than he had expected it to be. He tore the piece in half the way he had been taught to tear bread, and he spread a thin layer of the butter across it, the way his grandmother had always done it, and he took a small bite. The bread was soft and warm and faintly sweet, and the butter was good, and he chewed slowly. He did not cry. He had decided somewhere on the walk over that he was not going to cry in front of Mr. Holloway, but a quick small heat moved behind his eyes, and he kept them down on the blue and white checked cloth, and he took another bite. Edward did not watch him eat. This was the kindness Samuel noticed first, the kindness that he would think about often in the years to come, the kindness of an old man who had understood, somehow, without being told, that a hungry child being watched while he ate was a hungry child being made into a small piece of theater for the comfort of an adult. Edward broke off his own piece of bread. He spread his own thin layer of butter. He turned his eyes slightly toward the window and the gray December street, and he ate. He talked, while they both ate, about small, unimportant things. About the way Pittsburgh had changed since he was a young man, about a baseball game his son had taken him to last summer, about a tree on the property where he lived that had finally come down in a storm in October, and that he was still negotiating, somewhat unhappily, with the woman who managed his grounds about whether to replace it with another tree of the same kind or something different. He spoke in the way a person speaks in order to put a soft, undemanding sound into a room. The way you might leave a small lamp on for someone who has come in from the dark. Margaret brought the soup. It was a thick golden potato soup with bits of leek and small flakes of pepper floating on top, and it came in a heavy white bowl with a thick handle on each side. She set the bowls down in front of them and she said, "There is more of that. You let me know." She set a small plate of sliced ham and a wedge of cheese in the middle of the table. She brought a sandwich for Samuel, cut into 4 neat triangles on a small plate. She did not announce any of it. She simply put the food down and went away. Samuel ate the soup slowly. He held the spoon the way his grandmother had taught him to hold a spoon, which was not the way the older boys at the shelter had held theirs. He ate 2 of the 4 triangles of the sandwich, and then he stopped, because his stomach had grown unfamiliar with this much food, and had begun to send him uncertain signals about what it could and could not accept. Edward saw him stop and did not push him to eat more. The remaining 2 triangles would, Samuel knew without being told, find their way into a small paper bag at the end of the meal, the way good things sometimes follow you home when you are with the right person. "Sir," Samuel said after a long, quiet moment. "Yes, Samuel. May I ask you a question? You may ask me anything." Samuel set his spoon down carefully against the edge of his bowl. He folded his hands in his lap. He looked at Edward across the blue and white cloth, and the steam from his soup rose between them in a thin, curling line. "Why are you doing this for me?" Edward did not answer right away. He set his own spoon down. He picked up his coffee, which Margaret had brought without being asked, and he took a slow sip, and he set the cup back into its saucer. "That is a fair question," Edward said, "and it deserves a real answer." He looked at Samuel for a long moment across the small table. The light through the steamed window had turned the color of pale honey, the way the light in the eastern parts of Pittsburgh turns at 4 o'clock in December, just before it gives up and lets the street lamps take over. Edward folded his hands together on the table. His knuckles were knotted from a lifetime of work, and the wedding ring on his left hand had been worn down to a thin band that was almost the same color as the skin around it. "When I was about your age," Edward began, "I lived with my mother and my younger sister in a town in Ohio called Steubenville. My father had died when I was 6 in an accident at the mill where he worked, and the company had paid my mother a small settlement and then forgotten that we existed. My mother took in laundry. She washed sheets and shirts and tablecloths for the families who lived up on the hill, the ones who still had a little money even when the mill closed, and the town began to come apart. I used to deliver the laundry for her after school in a wooden cart with one bad wheel that I had to keep balanced just so, or the whole thing would tip. He paused. He took another small sip of his coffee. One afternoon in the winter, when I was 11 years old, the same age you are now, I was walking the cart up the hill with a delivery for a family named Andrews. The wheel was worse than usual that day. The cart was full. There was ice on the road. About halfway up the hill, the cart slipped and went over on its side, and the laundry, which my mother had spent 2 days washing and ironing and folding by hand, went out of the cart and into the snow and the mud at the side of the road. Samuel had stopped eating. He was watching Edward's face with the careful, steady attention of a child who understood that he was being told a story that mattered. "I sat down in the snow next to the cart," Edward said, "and I cried." I was 11 years old and I had ruined 2 days of my mother's work, and I knew, because my mother had told me before I left the house, that the Andrews family was going to pay her $4 that afternoon, and that $4 was the difference between us eating that week and us not eating that week. I sat in the snow next to the cart and I cried, because I did not know what else to do. He stopped for a moment. He looked down at his hands. A man came out of the house I was sitting in front of. I had never seen him before. He was an old man, much older than I am now, or so he seemed to me at the time. He was in his 70s, I would guess. He walked out into the cold without a coat on, and he saw me sitting in the snow, and he saw the cart, and he saw the laundry, and he did not say a word. He bent down and he started picking up the laundry, piece by piece. He brushed off the snow, and he shook the mud loose where he could, and he gathered everything into his arms, and he carried it inside his house. I followed him. I did not know what else to do. Samuel was very still. His wife was a small woman with white hair. They had no children of their own. The two of them took every piece of that laundry into their kitchen, and they put a kettle on, and they spread the worst of it on a long table. And for the next 6 hours, while I sat at their table eating bread and butter and a bowl of soup very much like the one you just ate, those two old people rewashed my mother's laundry. They washed it and they rinsed it and they hung it on a wooden rack near their stove to dry. And when it was dry, the old woman ironed every single piece, and they folded it, and they helped me load it back into the cart, and they walked with me up the rest of the hill in the dark to make sure I got to the Andrews house safely. Edward's voice had grown quiet. Samuel could see, in the soft honey light through the window, that the old man's eyes were brighter than they had been a moment ago. His name was Mr. Calloway. Her name was Edith. They had a small grocery on the corner of our street that I had walked past every day of my life without ever thinking about who ran it. After that night, Edith Calloway fed me supper 3 times a week for almost 4 years. She fed my sister, too, when my sister was old enough to walk with me. She fed my mother on the Sundays when my mother was too tired to lift a pan. They never asked for anything. They never made any of us feel that we had become a burden. When I was 15 years old, Mr. Calloway died of a stroke at his counter on a Tuesday morning. Edith lived another 2 years, and then she went too. They had no one to leave the grocery to, and the store closed, and the building was eventually torn down for a parking lot. He looked across the table at Samuel. "What you did for me today, Samuel," Edward said quietly, "you did for me what they did for me a long time ago, and so what I am doing for you tonight is what they did for me. That is all. That is the whole answer." Samuel looked down at the blue and white checked cloth for a long time. He did not trust himself to look up just yet. He thought about the laundry in the snow on a hill in Steubenville 60-some years ago. He thought about a small boy crying in the cold, and an old man who had come out of a house without a coat on and started picking up shirts. He thought about Edith Calloway, who had ironed somebody else's work for free for 4 hours, and then walked a child up a dark hill so that the $4 his mother needed would still be paid. He thought about his own mother, who he could only just remember, and his grandmother who could no longer remember him. He thought about the small, careful animal of hope that he had been carrying inside his chest for 2 weeks, and he thought that maybe he had been allowed to set it down for a little while here at this table in this warm room that smelled of bread. "Sir," he said, his voice was very small, "I do not know what to say." "You do not have to say anything, Samuel. Eat your sandwich." Samuel almost laughed. It was a thin, small sound, halfway between a laugh and the other thing he had decided he was not going to do, and it surprised him. He picked up one of the triangles of the sandwich. He took a bite. He chewed slowly. The food felt different in his mouth now, less like a thing he was afraid would be taken from him and more like a thing he had been given. They finished the meal slowly. Margaret brought a small bowl of bread pudding warm from the oven with a spoon of cream on the top, and she set it down between them with 2 spoons, and she said, "I made too much. You would be doing me a favor." Edward and Samuel each took a spoon. Samuel had not tasted bread pudding before, and the first spoonful made him close his eyes for a second without meaning to. Edward saw it and looked away politely toward the window. When the meal was over, Edward settled the bill with Margaret in a way that Samuel did not see, because Edward had a particular skill in such matters, the skill of a man who did not want any child sitting at his table to feel that he had become a transaction. Margaret walked them to the door. She lowered herself again to Samuel's height, and she said, "You come back whenever you like, Samuel Greer, with Mr. Holloway or without. You walk in that door and you tell whoever is at the counter that Margaret is expecting you, and there will be a chair and a bowl and a piece of bread." "Thank you, ma'am." The street outside had grown darker while they had been inside. The street lamps had come on, soft yellow against the deepening blue of the early evening sky. The cold had a different quality to it now, the harder kind that came down after sunset and stayed all night. A long, dark car was pulled up against the curb across the street. A man in a wool driver's cap was standing beside it, his hands clasped in front of him, and when he saw Edward come through the door, he straightened but did not move forward. He had worked for Edward Holloway for 19 years, and he had learned, the way Marcus before him had learned for another man in another city, that Mr. Holloway did not like to be rushed and did not like to be crowded and did not like, more than anything, to be made into a spectacle on a sidewalk. Edward turned to Samuel before crossing the street. "Samuel," he said, "I am going to ask you one more thing tonight, and again you are free to say no." "Yes, sir." Edward looked at the boy for a long, quiet moment. The street lamp above them threw a soft pool of light around them both, and Samuel's breath came out small and white into the cold air, and Edward's came out slower and longer and the same. "I live east of the city," Edward said, "in a stone house that has been too quiet for the last 9 months. My wife passed away in March. We had 2 children together, and they are both grown and gone, and the house has more rooms than one old man knows what to do with. There is a guest room on the ground floor with its own bathroom, and its own door that locks from the inside. There is a woman named Helen who lives in a small apartment over the garage and who has worked with my family for 26 years. She is a grandmother 5 times over, and she has more patience than anyone I have ever known. I would like to offer you that room for tonight, and for tomorrow night if you would like to stay, and for as many nights as it takes for us to figure out together and with your caseworker what comes next. You would not be a guest who has to earn anything. You would be a young man under my roof, and you would be safe there, and no one would take you anywhere you did not want to go." He paused. The cold air moved between them. "You may say no, Samuel. The car across the street can take you anywhere you would like to go tonight, and I will not be hurt, and I will not be offended. But I am 81 years old, and I have learned that some offers, when they are honest, should be made plainly. So I am making it plainly." Samuel stood on the cold sidewalk in his 2 short jeans and his 2 large sneakers, and he looked up at the old man in the long camel coat, and he thought about a guest room with a door that locked from the inside, and a bed with clean sheets, and a grandmother 5 times over named Helen. "Yes, sir," he said. "Thank you, sir, I would like that." The drive east took longer than the drive across the park had taken on foot. Edward's driver, whose name was James, opened the rear door of the long, dark car and held it open without comment until Samuel climbed in. The seat was wider than the couch in his grandmother's apartment had been, and the leather was warm because the car had been kept running with the heater on while it waited. Samuel sat very still with the paper bag from Margaret's, which now held the 2 remaining sandwich triangles, on his lap. He did not touch anything he did not need to touch. Edward settled in beside him with the same slow, careful motion he had used at the bench, and James closed the door and slid into the driver's seat, and the car pulled away from the curb. They left the brick row houses behind. They left the small, bright shops with their fogged windows. They left the long, quiet streets of the eastern neighborhoods and moved out into the suburbs, and then past the suburbs, into the rolling country east of the city where the houses sat far back from the road behind long driveways and old trees. Samuel watched it all through the window. He did not say anything for most of the drive. Edward did not push him to. Once, when Samuel's eyes began to grow heavy in the warm leather seat, James, without being asked, turned the heater up a single quiet degree. The house, when they reached it, was not the kind of house Samuel had pictured a rich man would live in. It was a long, low farmhouse of pale fieldstone with a slate roof and a wide front porch and warm yellow light spilling from the windows on the lower floor. A woman in her 60s with a soft, round face and silver hair pinned back from her forehead was waiting in the front hall when James opened the door. She was exactly as Edward had described her, and her name was Helen, and she did not make a fuss over Samuel when she saw him. She simply said, "Welcome, Samuel. The room is ready. The water is hot if you would like a bath, and the bed is turned down whenever you are ready for it. Are you hungry?" And Samuel, who had not realized until that moment how tired he was, shook his head and said, "No, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am." And Helen smiled and led him down a short hallway to a small, warm room with a single bed and a quilt that smelled faintly of lavender and a door that locked from the inside. That was the beginning. The story did not end that night because real stories rarely do. It went on through the winter and into the spring. Edward's lawyers, quietly and carefully, and without making any of it look like charity, helped untangle the long knot of Samuel's situation, found his grandmother a place in a better facility where she received the care she needed, and worked with Mrs. Alvarez and the county to make Edward and Helen Samuel's legal guardians while his grandmother's condition was assessed. Samuel went back to school, a different school, where the teachers had been told only that he had been through a difficult year and that he was to be allowed to be quiet when he needed to be quiet. He kept the small white business card in the inside pocket of a new coat that fit him properly, and he kept the photograph of his mother and grandmother in the same pocket. And after a few weeks, he stopped checking that the card was still there every morning, because he had begun, slowly, to believe that it would be. The story of how they had met did not appear in any newspaper. There had been no security cameras on the path in Allegheny Commons that afternoon, and no one in the city of Pittsburgh had any idea that one of the quietest and largest philanthropists in the state had stopped to rest on a public bench and let a hungry boy walk him to a soup he could not have eaten alone. The story stayed where it had begun, between the two of them and the small handful of people whose names belong in a story of this kind: Margaret, Helen, James. They were the kind of people who knew how to hold a story that was not theirs to tell. Years passed. Edward lived almost 9 more of them, which was longer than any of his doctors had predicted, the way stubborn old men sometimes outlive their prognoses when they have found a reason to stay. He saw Samuel finish middle school and then high school. He saw him take the college entrance examinations and apply to universities and accept a scholarship to a school in Ohio that had been arranged, without Samuel's knowledge, by a foundation that did not appear to be connected to Edward Holloway in any way the public records could trace. He did not see Samuel graduate from college because he died on a quiet Sunday morning in February in the stone farmhouse, with Helen sitting in the chair beside the bed and Samuel, then 19, holding his hand. In Edward's will, among the long and complicated arrangements that came with a long and complicated life, there was a short letter for Samuel. It said only this: "I want you to remember 3 things. The first is that your grandmother is still a school nurse for 31 years, and she always will be. The second is that you gave up a bench for me when no one else would have. The third is that the world becomes warmer one bench at a time, one bowl of soup at a time, one offered hand at a time, and you, Samuel Greer, made it warmer for me." Samuel is 41 years old now. He runs an organization in Pittsburgh that finds children sleeping in parks and on benches and in the cold places of the city, and offers them a door that locks from the inside, a meal that asks no questions, and a person who will sit with them until they are no longer alone. He named the organization after a small grocery in Steubenville that does not exist anymore. He calls it Callaway House. If this story touched something in you, leave a comment telling me what part stayed with you, and subscribe for more quiet stories of kindness passed from one hand to the next. Thank you for being here.